with the Pacific Northwest Climate Impacts Research Consortium, or CIRC. CIRC is a climate science to climate action team funded by NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment, or RISA program. So we thank Kai and our partner institute at the Conservation Biology Institute for hosting this webinar series. And this is the 7th webinar in this series, in which Holly Hartmann will discuss decision support tool evaluation from an academic research perspective. Holly is the Director of Climate Science Applications for Carpe Diem West. She's a leader in research related to the development of decision support tools for climate, water, and other resource management applications. Holly joined us in CIRC in 2015 to help us develop and improve our decision support tools and resources. So it'll be about a 40-minute presentation, and like Kai mentioned, we'll have time for some questions and discussions afterwards. So go ahead, Holly.
Oh, thanks, Megan, and thanks to everybody for coming to another one of our webinars in this series. We're shifting gears a little bit and talking about a different topic. We've focused recently on the decision support tools themselves, and for today we're going to start looking at a broader perspective about the decision support tools and resources and the challenges of their evaluation from an academic perspective. So here's how it's going to go. I'm going to start off as usual about just defining what is decision support, talk a little bit about how I came to this topic, and then go into our overall CIRC framework to put some context about the specific topic of today, which is an academic perspective about decision support tools. And then when you can see in the lower box, I'm going to be looking at just the specific decision support tool context and the challenges that creators of tools face. I'm going to go over some existing frameworks for evaluating decision support work, and then present the proposed framework for CIRC 2.0 application. And then we'll finish up with talking about some next steps. And just so it's clear, today's talk may seem a little abstract, but the next step is practical application, and that's what the next webinar will focus on, with some real examples from the CIRC 2.0 projects. So in thinking about what is decision support, I like to use the definition provided by the National Academy panel that created the report Informing Decisions in a Changing Climate in 2009. It says, climate change decision support refers to efforts not just to produce and deliver data and information, but to also facilitate its use to improve the quality and effectiveness of decisions. So it's not enough just to create something and put it out there. If we're creating decision support tools or doing decision support, we need to connect and actually facilitate the use of that data and information and tools. So how did I come to this as a topic? Well, I've worked as a research scientist to bring hydroclimatic science to decision makers and stakeholders for over 30 years, dealing with forecasts, projections, scenarios, and connecting with people about policy and programs, their practices, and delivering products, actually delivering products. And I've grappled with the practicalities of meeting the needs of decision makers and stakeholders, and I've grappled with evaluating my activities and my projects and my overall research programs using existing frameworks. There's a challenge, and I think I've talked with some of you about it one-on-one or in small groups over time. The proposed framework for the evaluation of CIRC's decision support research that I'm going to be presenting here, it seems to me to more accurately reflect the kinds of work we all actually do and have to do to serve decision makers and stakeholders within the whole climate science enterprise. This is decidedly a practitioner's perspective. My background, my training isn't in evaluation or but just through my work and engagement with others, we've had to figure out how to evaluate our own work to figure out if we're doing the right thing. And that evaluation doesn't necessarily meet with current frameworks or approaches, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Just to put this in the context of where we are within CIRC 2.0, and I do want to stress for people who are listening, this webinar is it's targeted for the CIRC 2.0 team. We have other people listening because I think the topic has some broader relevance. But when we open up the conversation at the end, we'll have a chance for both CIRC and the broader attendees to ask questions and make comments. But this shows where we fit within the CIRC 2.0 project. We've talked a lot about that box labeled number 1, about how we can have our decision support tools effectively facilitate the use of data and information and building adaptive capacity and so on. But we're focusing now on how the decision support tools and their use should be evaluated, number 3. And we've talked in the past about the evaluation from a decision maker's perspective, and then from the climate science enterprise about moving things to operations. But we're focusing on that last one now. How do you evaluate the tools and decision support within the research community, and specifically from the academic institutions, that is your department and your university? There's a real challenge in getting decision support tool work seen in a way that may be as equal as other outputs that are valued by academic institutions. So here's where we've been so far. I'm not going to go over this too much other than just to say this is the map of where we've been in the past webinars. You can see the various topics, and we have several different frameworks, one focusing on the decision maker and user perspective that has a number of components. And I will bring up things related to utility and suitability and usability and so on. And from this academic research perspective. And we've also talked a little bit about the technical sustainability, keeping a tool and decision support going over time. So we've got 2 webinars on this topic. One today is focused on the frameworks and the challenges, and then the next one will be on the specific application of that framework. So let's take a look at the challenge of thinking about decisions in a climate context. There's some real challenges. One, we're looking at disruptions in natural variability and experiencing widespread change across large regions. We're looking at coupled human and natural systems reaching thresholds or crossing thresholds like you see here for the Colorado river flows in that lower left-hand image, where supply and demand are now, the slack in the system is gone. And so we can experience surprise. And we're looking at complex systems. As you can see, the Envision model that's reflected here on the right tries to reflect that complexity. And it's real easy to see how there's so much interconnectedness in issues that we're facing today across sectors, not just water, not just public health, and so on. There's a lot of interconnectedness across organizations. We're seeing so that it's difficult to even define a problem. And I think most of you know that, is that when we go out and deal with stakeholders, a big part of our first engagements are just figuring out what a group's problems really are. Folks may not be able to express it beyond a frustration. And then in thinking about whether we're going to solve problems, for a lot of these issues and challenges, there is no solution. It's simply managing dilemmas, managing choices, and changing choices, changing stresses, changing challenges. And that fits the classic definition of wicked problems. That is, that it's difficult to even define the problem, let alone figure out a solution. There is no real solution. So where does that put us in relation to decision support tools? Well, it's that from the climate science enterprise perspective, we're trying to support climate adaptation at a scale and pace that's commensurate with the climate challenges. So it means that we're developing tools and resources that can be applied by a wide range of users who want specific analysis for their needs. and that implies making something like guidebooks, workbooks, or software that all allows us to scale up the use of those decision support tools and decision support processes, and then to also facilitate intermediaries delivering or engaging with communities long after we're disengaged from a particular project. Those are real challenges. And when it comes to developing software in particular, the challenge is that it's not enough just to develop a tool, a set of software once, but there has to be commitment to that software over time. The cost of maintenance is the majority of the cost of a project, and that we've got to provide continuity in those tools because they take time to learn. We're asking decision makers to provide input in developing them. There's some real challenges in creating good and effective software. You've heard this in the sustainability webinar. That is, when a when a tool is easy to use, it's because it's been a lot of hard work in the background with security and architecture, data policies, metadata connections. Those are the kind of things that are not publishable units, but are a big part of what goes into creating tools. And then when we're looking at tools, we know that the more engagement that people have related to climate science and understanding the information that's out there, it leads to more demand for more engagement. So our challenges grow larger as people want new pieces, new functionalities applied to tools, or an increased scale of application of tools, connecting with other tools, and so on. And when we understand that there's, since computers have been created, this valley of death has been a challenge facing software developers. Is you develop a tool and there's such a gap between how do you get that tool into a sustained a location that will sustain that tool, including the maintenance, over the long run. And that usually requires transferring to other institutions. And that's ultimately about institutional issues, going back to the challenges there, and it's people issues. That in connecting and getting software into other organizations, we have to deal with people and institutional issues. And then for any of us who've been in this field, it's clear that it's not just the software developer that makes or breaks a software project. It's the whole team, that a tool exists within a larger decision support process or set of processes. And those, again, are ultimately institutional and people issues that are really beyond what a software developer should be responsible for. So those are some of the particular challenges dealing with just the software part, or you can think about decision support resources more broadly as well, but there's some specific software challenges. And so I'm going to cut to the chase right here, just for anybody who has to leave early or tunes out a little bit as we go along. But I'm just showing you that one piece of the proposed framework that deals specifically with decision support tools, you can see that it's number 4. It implies that this framework is larger than just decision support tools as software. We have digital publication issues, like just how you turn a tool into a publication and get credit for that as a publication. But we have other issues, we have other pieces, including the outside perspectives. And then you can see these last two about adoption and use and the impact. Those are the kinds of things that connect with more traditional evaluation frameworks. And in thinking about a decision support tool, it's not enough to focus on just that first piece, just the publication itself, that it's the others, and those others are often difficult to, they're not necessarily publishable either. So how do we get credit for those, and how do we communicate about that? So that's just the quick and dirty that helps you maybe understand where the decision support tools fit into this as we go forward, because this is a more abstract kind of presentation, and I know that can be frustrating. So I want to take a little bit jump back to this setting for decision support and revisit that we're dealing with widespread change, increasing vulnerabilities, and these wicked problems that are different than just a standard problem just that we can define and then come up with a solution and implement and move on. I want to look at some existing frameworks for evaluation of projects. And I think most of you are familiar with the logic model. This is comes out of a problem focus kind of theory of change, that you look at your problem, provide inputs, do certain activities, and get outputs and outcomes. I'm not going to go into the details about this. Anybody connected with a land grant institution like Oregon State, they're familiar with this. Cooperative Extension has done a lot to develop this. And I think at Oregon State, there are, I don't know if, let's see. There's specific offices at every university that deal with helping people implement the logic model. And the logic model, there are people that are very good at getting a project to fit within a logic model, or using a logic model to define a program or a project. I'm not trying to fight or disparage the logic model. I do want to point out that there have been a number of National Academy panels and reports coming out of that work that have reviewed and explicitly rejected the logic model when it comes to dealing with climate change and overall environmental decision making. It's not a new rejection of the logic model. The report from 2005 on valuing ecosystem services specifically looked at the logic model and rejected it as being appropriate for these complex, wicked problems. The America's Climate Choices report specifically recommended the deliberation with analysis, which is a processed framework for evaluating decision support projects and resources. And that includes looking at the context and just choosing techniques to look at it, to monitor what you're doing and iterate. That seems pretty simple. And I think maybe that's what's maybe scary about using something like this as a framework, because it does seem a little vague. The report by the National Academy panel that came out with the report on informing decisions in a changing climate was a little more specific, I think, and maybe more helpful in actually coming up with a framework. And you can see how it maps to the America's Climate Choices and the deliberation with analysis framework up there, where you begin with the user's needs in mind, that is diagnosing your context, and then choosing the techniques. You're giving priority to process, not to the products, not to the outcomes, but to the process itself. You're trying to link the producers of information and their users and build this connections across disciplines and organizations. And then we're trying to seek stability of institutions, and that would include stability of components of the institution, like decision support tools. How do you maintain those and sustain those over the long run? And then to develop processes for learning, which gets at the iteration, not just iteration about a problem, but actually learning about how effectively to deal with challenges. So it's a more explicit framework with more detail. And then there's been a lot of work by others in other fields. Here in CIRC, we have Denise and Eva looking at networks, and there's the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international organization. They focused on this a lot as well, and there's a lot of research dealing with networks. I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert in that, but it's clear that when it comes to decision support, there's a need to prioritize work with networks. The question is how do you actually evaluate whether your process of working with networks is effective, and can you demonstrate deep understanding, and then also track stability of that engagement, stability of the network over time. So those are some of the existing kind of frameworks out there. They come from a number of different disciplines. I do want to point out that the NOAA Climate Program Office and the RESA programs are all working on other metrics that not necessarily in a formal framework, but just in a practical list of metrics and measures. And these are the ones that seem to be emerging. And there was a meeting today that I didn't go to in the morning, I think, but I've seen the emails. These are the kinds of things that they're asking us to track. You can see that the metrics are the more broadly defined pieces like collaborations and leveraged funds and the scope of the impact and so on. And measures are things that you can actually see or count, for example. And I'm not going to go through this list. I think we'll hear more from at our CIRC monthly meetings about this, and we'll be seeing more from the Climate Program Office about it. But I just want to list this here to show that even today we're grappling with, across the RESAs, how to keep track of things, how to communicate things, and then think about where you fit in here with decision support tools and the kind of decision support research and applications you do and how they're reflected in these kinds of metrics and measures. It's clear that we still need something a little bit more. And so that's where we're headed here. And so what I've put together, again, is a practitioner's perspective. I have looked at a number of different fields and disciplines to see and get a sense of how they're tracking things like research scholarship, program evaluation, and specifically within universities, how are they handling non-traditional products like data sets, websites, and this decision support tools. But there are other fields, like the OECD focuses on technical R&D, and how do you track innovation, and how do you track the technology transfer across organizations. And then there's a whole group of, more from an academic perspective, that Roger Polardi and Carlisle and others are have really developed that look at networks, and then specifically this notion of science translation, technology or science transfer, and then the transformation of decisions or programs, policies, and so on. And so what you'll see here is sort of an integration of these different of the approaches used in these different fields into this more of what I consider more of a practitioner's framework. And so the first piece is just simply looking at the accomplishments. It's something not too different than we're all used to. You can go back to the RESA list of metrics, and it doesn't seem too different. It's just that it's maybe a little more expansive. We're talking about just the spin-offs that come from engaging in that decision support process. It's easy to say what type of accomplishment it is in a logic model frame, that is, say, what is an outcome, an output, and an impact. But I think it's clear that that's not sufficient in describing what we do, and specifically not, or it's not sufficient in thinking about how those projects fit within the goals of the climate science enterprise. And so the other kinds of attributes are the scale of that outcome, output, or impact, whether it's just to an institution, a community, a state, and so on. And then the notion of linkages. We've talked in past webinars about the suitability and utility of decision support tools, knowing where your decision support tool fits within, for example, an iterative risk management framework. How does it connect with other tools? How does it connect with policies which apply at different scales? Does it connect with different decision-making roles, that is, at the policy level, program level, standards of practice, and so on? How does it connect with the research to operations, getting into operations or feeding back, reflecting the needs of the operational community like NOAA? And then another attribute is looking at the novelty, that is, that level of innovation of the accomplishment. And this comes straight out of the R&D innovation field, looking at, is it unique to an institution like Bonneville Power, for example, or is it unique to a sector or a market, whether it's water managers in a particular region, or is it, does it cross multiple markets, multiple sectors, so that it's sort of a novelty is much bigger in its dimension. And it's not to judge that small and large are better or worse. It's simply to document what is, and then it allows folks to see, does that fit with what the climate, where does that fit within the climate science enterprise needs? And then the last in this list is looking at the lifespan of a project. And here's a contrast with decision support resources, like putting out a guidebook or a handbook. It's something that's done. You move on, compared with decision support tools, where there is a lifespan and there needs to be a way to somehow get acknowledgement that a tool that is long-lived and that is still in use years later is doing something worth noting. So in looking at your project, the attributes, is it a project that has a clear lifespan, or is it one that the goal is to be sustained over the years? And to describe that then. And so those are just some of the accomplishments, might be considered outputs, I guess. But when we talk about impacts, we often struggle with how to talk about impacts, the language to use. And we struggle with whether we really have had an impact or not, and can we attribute it to our specific work. And so that's what these three elements are about. And that's, and this goes back to the folks that I mentioned early on in the presentation, like Roger Powarty. But the definitions of translation, transfer, and transformation are different in different disciplines. So what you see here is sort of a melding of terms and approaches coming out of different fields for these terms. When it comes to translation, I think the key piece here is that we're just trying to share meaning or share a body of knowledge across domains, across boundaries. And all it is just sharing our meaning and sharing meanings, sharing our knowledge. Look at what's at the top of the list, peer-reviewed publications. That's ultimately what they're about, is just sharing across domains. That is the researcher and the folks reading about it. Our presentations that we make are like that. The certain kinds of engagement are focused on this, on just simply on translation. I kind of have a list here. I'm not going to go through and read each one. You can see that just communication with others, when somebody calls the project office or asks CIRC to come out and give presentations, they're asking to share knowledge. They're maybe seeking innovation, but it's just that first sharing. And so we're looking at decision support tools. Just having that operation of tools is focused on sharing meaning. If it's just whether it's to support professional development training or being used by those information intermediaries or by end users. The other piece, the next, I'm not going to say next level, but it's just a different type. It's to actually do a transfer, where you're actually using your decision support resources and tools to actually change programs, to change practices, to provide services that didn't exist before. And so what you're trying to do is get knowledge across domain boundaries, but that there's a pathway for getting that knowledge integrated into that other domain that doesn't always exist. When you're just sharing meaning, just doing translation, you don't necessarily have a pathway for entraining that in a formal way. So that's the key part of transfer. And so that's where, if you're developing software, when you're adding functionality to an existing tool, that's clearly transfer. It's got a pathway for getting that new algorithm, for example, into an application. The climate test bed at NOAA is aimed in that direction. How do you get the research into an existing tool or bring it into an existing pathway for getting tools approved as official tools. Professional development training and the materials that support it can be a transfer if there's a pathway for that training to actually have an impact. For example, when an institution, say like the Weather Service, wants people to be trained, then expects them to use that training in their activities. That's a transfer, not just sharing meaning, but actual real transfer. And again, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but there's, the whole notion is that it's actually there's a pathway, a defined pathway for getting that decision support into application. And then the last is this notion of transformation. And I think when it comes to impact, maybe we're all after transformation, and certainly the climate change challenge demands that we have transformation. And so this is where we're seeing changes in programs, we're seeing changes in processes, we're seeing changes in products and services that are really far-ranging and in scale and scope, and that the organizations that are changing have invested resources on their own to implement that either as co-development, co-implementation, or independently, and that transformation persists beyond a project that we personally may be involved with. And so it's when we really see changes in organizational capacity, the priorities of an organization that is realizing, for example, fire risk is real and actually changing policies or programs, practices, and so on. And then changing culture and behavior. And we can see that within specific communities of practice, for example. If there's an initiation of a major new program with collaboration, that's a transformation of what an organization is doing. And when it comes to decision support systems and tools, for example, or specifically, it's when we see products that are different in character. So there may be 5 or 6 climate atlases out there. Another climate atlas isn't a transformative tool. It has other purposes, but it's not in and of itself transformative. So a tool that does something completely different is, or a functionality within an existing tool. And then so those are the 2 pieces. There's 2 other pieces within this overall evaluation framework, and that deals with the network issues, that is the people and the institution issues. And there's a number of attributes here, and I'm sure this needs to be adapted some. And Denise, I think I would hope that we can talk about this more sometime. And that is, but the pieces are looking at just the attributes of the network, which aren't too different than what we saw in other frameworks, but that is sort of what sector are we dealing with, what scale, what jurisdictions, what roles, like policy roles or a specific community of practice within an implementation area. And then what type of networks are we looking at? A learning network, like a community of practice, or is it a collective, a knowledge to action network, or is it something more like a collective impact network? What kind of network? And then we have measures or metrics and measures that deal with sustained engagement. How much time have we spent with that network? How much continuity of engagement have we had with that network? Or do we just helicopter in at specific times, do an activity, and then leave? And then do we have a specific role, a definable role within that network, starting with active engagement, just being engaged, not going to a workshop, but helping design, implement workshops, and having clearly defined contributions within that network. And then there's some parts of evaluating network engagement that it's not up to us to evaluate, but the networks themselves to evaluate. And that is a level of participation and collaboration and co-development. There's some things that we can see objectively that, for example, when someone is doing advisory services for a network or providing leadership roles within a network, that there is some acknowledged deep understanding by the researcher or the project of that network, that the network itself has judged to be significant. And then the last one of the component deals with what I showed you at the very start, which is the decision support tools and process component. So we're looking at, you can see here where just digital publication, that's the equivalent of peer review. That itself is a big challenge. It's much more than just getting a DOI number, which ultimately is just about paying some fees and registering. But how do you deal with not just your initial release, but extensions and long-term maintenance of your tools and your decision processes they support? There are some metrics and measures about looking at what the outside community thinks of your decision support tools and resources, whether it's through reviews, long-term funding, repeated funding, other organizations putting their reputation out in terms of approving or recommending your tool. And then you can see where these notions of other parts of the framework connect in with the decision support tool itself. That is describing the adoption and use, which ultimately gets back to the design priorities we talked about in an earlier webinar. That is, are we really, what was our project focus on? Was it focused on equity of access? Was it efficiency of, that is, the return on investment, economic efficiency of our research funding, or was it focused on impact, which may be at more of a policy level? So what was our tool and process designed for? And then using some of these other measures that connect with the impact, like translation, transfer, transformation, and continuity. So I think that's a quick introduction. I know it was pretty quick, but I want to leave time for discussion. And the things I'll leave you to consider, or things that maybe we can talk about, is, does your institution, that is whether it's your department or your university or your other institutions, do you have a review system in place for specifically decision support processes, for data sets, for websites, for software tools? And have your decision support process, that is activities, undergone academic review, and then have your tools themselves undergone academic review? Those are kind of the questions that we need, or it would be good to answer as part of going forward in CIRC 2.0. And I just want to drive home that through this webinar and through the others leading up to it, to make it clear that decision support tools are about supporting decision support processes, not the other way around. The processes don't support the tool and the development of a tool. The tool supports decisions by stakeholders and decision makers. And that broader decision support process needs a diverse team. It's not just software developers. It's much more than that. And it's much larger really than an individual researcher working with a software developer. It is about a broader team, about connecting with networks and institutions to create the situations where there can be long-term sustainability of tools, and you can do more than translation, but do transfer and transformation as well. And I want to highlight that publishing about a decision support tool is not the same as publishing a decision support tool. Folks who create data sets have struggled with this for a long time, and I think they've found a way to get more credit for data sets and keeping those data sets up that's not necessarily translated over to decision support tools and their creators. And the corollary of that is peer review of a decision support tool publication is not the same as peer review of the tool itself. And so in thinking about how a tool itself gets peer reviewed, that's our framework has some pieces of that when we go back in to look at these outside perspectives. That includes peer review of the tool itself, not just a publication about the tool. And that finally, just to stress that publication is a small part of the outcomes and impacts, whether it's for a paper about a tool or whether it's the tool itself. It's the outcomes and impacts have to support the decision makers and the stakeholders. And so with that, I think I'll just say where we're going, finish this up. We've got one more webinar that deals with the academic perspective, where we're going to do some specific evaluations, show the specific application of this framework to some of the CIRC 2.0 tools. And then we don't have it scheduled yet, but I don't know whether we want to schedule it, but the idea is that, that from each of the webinars that we've had, I need to update the white paper, which came out in October 2016. And I didn't know whether to update it before we finished all the webinars, but I think at this point, it may be worthwhile just to update it at the end of the next webinar so that it's all just one revision rather than just a rolling revision. And the same go for the checklists. And so maybe we can revisit whether we should do a webinar to kind of wrap that up with the checklists and the revisions or whatever. But I just put that out there as the potential for just to highlight that there is one more round at the end of this this series of webinars.
All right, thank you, Holly. If there are any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them into either the question box or the chat box, or raise your hand, and we can take your questions. And CIRC team, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
Holly, this is Denise. You can imagine I have some questions.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Not only because it's not only CIRC that I work on with decision support tools, it's other projects. And how do decision support tools get peer reviewed? Who does that, and what does it look like?
Yeah, and so at some levels, right, the notion that a decision support tool, there is no formal process that exists like peer review of publications in an informal way. So you have to get at it in an informal way. So if we go up to this, follow-up funding is one way because proposals get reviewed. Somebody's making a decision to keep funding something. And those are the peers not of academia, but the peers of the folks doing the reviews, right? That's the peer group. And then external reviews of the tools, those don't exist for all the tools. For an example would be when something like a tool is you can see here over on the right-hand side, if it's in the water toolbox, if it's in the climate resilience toolkit, when we had the Carpe Diem West Academy, those were specific criteria used for reviewing the tools dealing with their utility and suitability. So some of those criteria that we talked about in early webinars they provide the structure. And then projects like the Resiliency Toolkit or the Water Toolbox provide the evidence, I guess. Does that help at all?
Kind of.
It's not satisfying though, is it?
No. No, because it seems like a lot of times what we're doing with our science is we're trying to push the edge of what we know about our discipline. Mm-hmm. And in the decision support tools that we're working with, especially when we're co-producing them or engaging with stakeholders, is we're designing them for specific issues and specific problems. And so when you think about, so they're more like case studies or something. I'm not sure quite how to frame that yet, but I'm trying to think about what that might look like for any of the tools that I'm involved in developing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what some of those other frameworks are about, is to say, do these decision support tools meet some of the basic elements of what you expect, what the field expects from any decision support tool. And then from the decision makers and stakeholders perspective, it's a whole different set of criteria or measures and metrics. And none of them in and of themselves are satisfying. And from a climate science enterprise perspective, evaluating them on a problem-specific basis isn't enough. Even implementing them on a problem-specific basis isn't enough because of the scale of the climate challenge and the pace. Trying to keep up with the pace of the climate challenge means that we've got to have tools that are expansive but allow people to focus on their specific needs, but it covers more than just a pilot study here, a pilot study there, and a pilot study in another spot. And so how do you, and that's where the software projects or something like the guidebooks and handbooks, maybe they were designed out of engagement related to a specific project, a problem or project, but they ultimately have broader application.
So do you know if a domain like computer science, which has been developing software for years, do they have a peer review process that might be applicable at some level, or at least be a place to start? I don't know. Mostly what they're doing is writing papers, and I agree with you that writing a paper about your tool isn't the same thing as having your tool evaluated.
Yeah, and this changes so much that it is a shifting foundation for evaluation. And I'll just show, just as an example, it wasn't so long ago when I was doing an evaluation, it was recommended to me a particular framework, and the criteria were that one of the criteria was your tool on its own server.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now all you have to do is lease a server off in the cloud somewhere, or you can implement virtual machines. It's inexpensive. It has it's just, the point is moot.
Right.
Is it the number of users? Well, there's many ways to measure that. And I've run into projects where they're counting every spider or crawler or bot or their own staff, their only developers, all of their hits are counted. And when you take all that out, it reveals something very different. And if you're developing tools that have a small audience, the number of hits is not an appropriate measure either. So there is I'll just say there's nothing that's satisfying. In what I've seen, there is nothing satisfying that way.
Okay, that's discouraging. I thought
it is.
Really bad. And then I bring it back.
Yeah. And so I think one of the points is that that's one of the advantages of approaching this out of a CIRC perspective. It isn't just the individual researchers in their own office struggling with this in the dark, because it is something that keeps people up at night. What's their responsibility to a tool if what they get rewarded for is writing about the tool and then moving on? And you get questions of, why are you still working with that? Or just, are you done with that tool? Well, no, you're never done if you actually think about it from a broader perspective of decision support.
And that's been a real issue among our academic partners. Mm-hmm. It seems like it's less of an issue with our partners at CBI because they're all about developing tools and innovating. And
their review process is something decidedly different, right?
Right.
Holly, we have another question from Lisa Dilling. She says, please, can you give an example of how to turn one element of the framework into something that a RISA can measure and track, how to make it really concrete for week-to-week data collection?
So she's thinking
of things like transfer and transformation and elements of the types of networks and documenting how the work made a difference.
Right. Well, documenting how work makes a difference is that is a challenge. But when you see, I think just first of all, identifying that there is a difference in what you're trying to do, whether it's translation, transfer, or transformation, is one step forward. And then some of those have very clear, objective evidence, like peer-reviewed publications, a simple count, right? So it's another example is engagement. Workshop facilitation. How many workshops did you facilitate? You can come up with the attributes of that kind of facilitation. Was it an initial contact? Was it a part of a continued project? When you get into some of these others, this notion of looking at decision support systems, if you're putting something extending an existing software application, that's something that's definable. There's evidence for that. So some are much more concrete than others. When you look at having your work connected to other kind, look, the bottom one on this list is when your research is transferred into somebody else's products. An example would be Comet. That is the Comet training organization that's in Colorado, where they train people across a number of organizations. They connect with people to be the content experts and external project advisors for putting together training programs. Well, if your work, your decision support tools, your decision support products are integrated into those training programs, those are the kind of things that are objective evidence to be documented. Does that help at all, Lisa?
She can't.
She says yes, thank you.
Yeah, because
she says yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, because you can go through each one of these, and that's what we'll be kind of getting at for the next webinar. But each one of these that's in the standard text is an overall metric. It's kind of a broader definition. And then the ones in italics are more what get at the measures, the things that you can see and count and describe. So each one of these has that kind of piece to it.
Right, if there are any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or the question box. We have a few more minutes.
And again, while people are maybe thinking of a question or a comment, I'll just stress that this is just, it's my perspective from being a practitioner in this field and trying to think about what I do and what I know that each of you do and have done over the years, and kind of the challenges of trying to document what it is that you do beyond writing a publication about what you've done.
We're so good at that.
Yeah, that's right. You're very good at that.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, but if a question comes up later, feel free to email me or Holly. Oops, it looks like there's one more question. From Dominique, how do students learn about translation science? Any courses at the U of O?
Maybe Denise, you can answer that, or somebody else there at Oregon State.
I don't know what's at U of O. Was that the question? Or was
the question is, in general, how do students learn about translation science, or at U of O or OSU? Is there anything out there for students?
Do you mean translational science, or? I'm not sure what that is.
Dominique?
Yeah, just how do students even learn about this as a topic? And I think it's in my view, just across institutions, it's sort of haphazard maybe, or opportunistic. At the University of Arizona, there have been courses. I think Greg Garfin's been involved in putting together some of those, and maybe some of the others involved with the RISA project or the CLEMAS project down there. Maybe some of the other RISAs could highlight what classes they've had for undergrads or graduate students in this area. Otherwise, there's been some training at professional development or professional societies, but it's more happenstance than anything consistently available. That's my view of it.
Okay, last call for questions before we finish up here. Okay. I'm seeing none. So Holly, thank you so much for your presentation. And I guess we'll just give a quick note on the next presentation covering the practical application of the academic research perspective will be on March 1st. So invite you all to tune in again in a month.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Holly.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.